I am Harrison Caldwell, 70 years old. My daughter banned me from the $300,000 Paris wedding I paid for, just because I don't speak French. She emailed, "Your presence and rough manners will embarrass me in front of my aristocratic French in-laws." She thought I was just a clueless, uncultured old construction worker with deep pockets. She forgot that before I made my first million pouring concrete in Chicago, I learned how to deal with backstabbers the hard way. I decided to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. The next morning, I woke up to 36 missed calls. Take a deep breath. Because the truth behind that aristocratic French wedding was filthier and more pathetic than anything you could ever imagine. I was sitting in my downtown Chicago office, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across my mahogany desk. My pen hovered over a bank authorization form. It was for a wire transfer of $150,000. The final payment for my daughter Stephanie's dream wedding at a chateau outside of Paris. I had already wired the first $150,000 3 months prior to secure the venue and the vendors. It was an obscene amount of money for a single weekend, but Stephanie was my only child. Since my wife Martha passed away 10 years ago, making sure Stephanie had everything she ever wanted had become my main objective. I had worked my fingers to the bone building my commercial construction and real estate business from the ground up specifically, so my family would never have to struggle. I was about to sign the document when a notification popped up on my computer screen. It was an email from Stephanie. The subject line simply read, "Travel arrangements." I smiled, assuming she had finalized my flight details for the wedding next week. I clicked it open. "Dad," the email began. "Bastian and I have been discussing the final logistics for the wedding week, and we've decided to make a slight change to your itinerary. We know how much you dislike formal European events and all the stuffy protocols, so we've booked you a luxury all-expenses-paid fishing trip in the south of France for the entire week of the wedding. It's a beautiful lodge, very secluded right on the water. You'll love it." I frowned, confused. A fishing trip during the week of her wedding. When was I supposed to walk her down the aisle? Kept reading, and the words on the screen began to blur as a cold realization set in. "The truth is, Dad," she wrote, "Bastian's family, the Rousseaus, are old French aristocracy. They are very particular about etiquette and social standing. Your blue-collar aura and the fact that you don't speak a word of French would just create too many awkward moments. It would humiliate me in front of his family and their society friends. We need this weekend to be flawless. Enjoy the fishing trip. We'll celebrate when we get back to the States." I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was reading. My own daughter. The girl I had raised, the girl I had put through the best private schools, the girl whose $300,000 wedding I was currently financing, was banning me from attending because my blue-collar aura would embarrass her. The sheer audacity, the staggering entitlement hit me like a physical blow. She was taking my money, the money I earned with those rough blue-collar hands, to buy her way into some fake European aristocracy, and then shutting me out so I wouldn't ruin the illusion. I felt a tight knot form in my chest, a mixture of profound sorrow and a sudden sharp anger. I had spent decades dealing with ruthless developers, corrupt contractors, and city politicians. I knew a hustle when I saw one. And right now I was being hustled by my own flesh and blood. I didn't yell, I didn't throw anything. The years had taught me that losing your temper just gives the other side an advantage. Instead, I picked up the phone. I dialed the number for Chloe, the high-end Parisian wedding planner I had been communicating with for the past 6 months. She answered on the second ring, her voice smooth and professional. "Bonjour, Monsieur Caldwell. How may I help you today?" I kept my voice perfectly level. "Chloe, I need to check on some logistical details for the reception next Saturday, specifically regarding the guest list and security." There was a slight hesitation on her end. A beat of silence that told me everything I needed to know before she even spoke. Yes, Monsieur Caldwell. Regarding security, Madame Stephanie requested a specific protocol." "What protocol exactly, Chloe?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. She sighed, clearly uncomfortable. She requested that we hire 2 additional private security guards for the main gate. Their specific instructions are to ensure that no one without an approved invitation enters the premises. She provided a photograph. A photograph of me? I asked. Yes, sir, Chloe admitted softly. Her instructions were very clear. If an older American gentleman matching your description attempted to enter the guards, were to politely but firmly escort him away. I am so sorry, Monsieur Caldwell. It is a highly unusual request, but she insisted. I closed my eyes, the reality of the betrayal settling deep into my bones. My daughter hadn't just suggested a fishing trip. She had actively planned to have me thrown out by hired muscle if I dared to show up at the wedding I was paying for. She was treating me like a stray dog sniffing around the back door of a fancy restaurant. Thank you, Chloe, I said. That clarifies things perfectly. I'll be in touch. I hung up the phone. I looked down at the bank authorization form for the final $150,000. My pen was still resting next to it. For a long time, I just sat there in the silence of my office. I thought about Martha. I thought about how we used to count pennies to make rent when we first got married. I thought about how proud I was to be able to provide a life for Stephanie where she never had to worry about money. But I had provided too well. I had shielded her from consequence, from the value of hard work, from the basic decency of respecting the people who sacrificed for you. She thought she could take my money and discard me like an old useless tool. She was about to find out exactly how a blue-collar Chicago contractor handles a breach of contract. I picked up my phone and dialed Stephanie's number. The international ringtone echoed in my silent office, each tone feeling like a heavy strike against an anvil. It rang 3 times, 4 times. I could picture her in Paris, sitting in some overpriced cafe, seeing my name light up her screen and feeling the sudden icy grip of panic. She knew the final wire transfer had not cleared yet. She knew she had made a fatal error by sending that email too soon. On the 5th ring, she answered. Her voice was breathy, pitched slightly higher than normal, a tone she always used when she was trying to sound innocent. Daddy, hi. I was just about to call you. Stephanie, I said, keeping my voice entirely stripped of emotion. I just received an interesting email from you about my travel arrangements for the wedding. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The silence that followed was thick with calculation. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head as she scrambled to construct a defense. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with perfectly manufactured tears. Oh, Dad. Oh, my God. You read that. Dad, please, you have to listen to me. I am so sorry. Oh. You are sorry that you booked me a fishing trip instead of a seat at my only daughter's wedding? I asked, letting a hint of genuine confusion bleed into my voice to feed her delusion. No, Dad, you do not understand, she cried, the sobs sounding remarkably authentic. I did not write that email. I swear to you I did not write it. Bastien's mother, Madame Genevieve, she drafted it. She is from a very old, very traditional French family. They have these rigid, outdated rules about society events. She has been pressuring me for weeks, telling me that the Parisian elites expect a certain decorum. She paused, sniffing loudly. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the ceiling, letting her dig the hole deeper. She drafted that email to show me what she wanted to say to you. Stephanie continued, her voice gaining a desperate momentum. I was horrified, Dad. I argued with her. I told her it was unacceptable. I only forwarded it to myself so I could show it to Bastien later and prove how unreasonable his mother was being. I must have accidentally put your email address in the recipient line. It was a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. It was a masterful performance. A plausible lie delivered with just the right amount of emotional distress. If I had not spoken to the wedding planner 5 minutes ago, if I had not learned about the hired security guards with my photograph in their hands, I might have believed her. I might have excused it as the madness of wedding planning and a toxic future mother-in-law. But I knew the truth. A mistake, I repeated slowly. So you do want me at the wedding? Well, she hesitated, the fake tears momentarily drying up. Dad, let us be honest. You hate these kinds of events. You always have. You hate wearing a tuxedo. You hate standing around making small talk with pretentious people drinking champagne. You are a meat and potatoes guy. I was actually trying to protect you. I am just trying to save you from a stressful weekend. A fishing trip in the south of France sounds exactly like something you would actually enjoy. You would be miserable at the chateau, surrounded by people speaking a language you do not understand. I just want you to be happy. The gaslighting was textbook. She was spinning her betrayal into an act of profound filial love. She was doing me a favor by exiling me from the most important day of her life. Before I could formulate a response, there was a shuffling sound on the line. A man's voice replaced my daughter's. It was Bastien. "Harrison, my friend," Bastien said. His thick French accent dripped with a condescending warmth that made my skin crawl. "Please accept my deepest apologies for this unfortunate misunderstanding. Stephanie is distraught. She loves you very much." "Bastien," I said, "I am trying to understand why my daughter's future mother-in-law is drafting emails to ban me from a wedding I am paying for." "European high society is incredibly judgmental, Harrison," Bastien said, adopting the tone of a patient teacher, explaining a simple concept to a slow child. "My family has a certain standing to maintain. The people attending this wedding are diplomats, financiers, individuals of noble birth. They operate on a different frequency. We simply wish to protect a hard-working, honest man like yourself from their cruel whispers. You are a man of the earth, a builder. You do not belong in a room full of vipers who will judge you for the calluses on your hands or your lack of refined etiquette." He was trying to flatter my working-class roots while simultaneously using them as the very reason I was unworthy to breathe the same air as his family. He was calling me a peasant to my face, wrapped in the guise of aristocratic chivalry. "I see," I murmured, staring at the pen on my desk. "So this banishment is really for my own protection." "Exactly, Harrison," Bastien said, his voice brightening with relief. "You understand. We knew a man of your practical wisdom would see the logic. Stephanie was so worried you would feel insulted, but I told her Harrison is a pragmatist. He will appreciate the peace and quiet of the French Riviera far more than a rigid, exhausting society gala." "And the security guards at the gate?" I asked quietly. "Are they for my protection too?" There was a sharp silence. I had thrown a wrench into their carefully constructed narrative. I could hear Bastien cover the receiver, a muffled, frantic whispering ensuing between him and Stephanie. They had not anticipated that I would call the wedding planner. They thought I was just an ignorant old man who would passively read an email and comply. Bastien came back on the line, his smooth delivery slightly fractured. "Ah, the security. Yes. Harrison, my mother is a very anxious woman. She insisted on strict protocol for all uninvited guests. It is nothing personal against you. It is merely a blanket policy for the estate's security, the peace of mind of our prestigious guests. Please do not take offense." It was a flimsy recovery, but I decided I had heard enough. I had the measure of these two. Confronting them now screaming through the phone would only alert them that the game was up. If I showed my hand, they would scramble, perhaps try to secure the funds through other means, or lock me out of my own money. I needed them to believe they had successfully manipulated me. I needed them complacent. I needed them to think the uncultured American contractor was entirely under their control. I forced a heavy, weary sigh into the phone. I let my shoulders slump, channeling the persona of an exhausted, defeated old man who simply did not have the energy to fight the complicated ways of European high society. "All right," I said, my voice thick with feigned resignation. "All right, Bastien. Put Stephanie back on the phone." A moment later, her voice returned, tentative and hopeful. "Dad, Stephanie," I said, softening my tone. "I will not lie to you. It hurts. It hurts a great deal. But I am an old man, and maybe you are right. I do not know the first thing about French aristocrats. I do not want to be the reason you are embarrassed on your wedding day. If you think I will be happier fishing down south, then I will go fishing." I heard her let out a massive, shuddering breath. The relief was palpable. "Oh, Dad. Thank you. Thank you so much for understanding. I promise we will do something special, just the two of us, as soon as we get back to Chicago. It will be absolutely perfect." "I am sure it will be," I replied smoothly. "And Dad," she added, her tone suddenly shifting to a brisk businesslike cadence, "the wedding planner mentioned that the final venue deposit is due by the end of business today, Paris time. Did you manage to handle that transfer?" There it was, the true purpose of the call. The fake tears, the gaslighting, the aristocratic excuses. All of it was just a smokescreen to ensure the money kept flowing. She did not care about my feelings or my presence. She only cared about the check. I picked up the pen from my desk. I held it between my thumb and forefinger, feeling the cool metal. I looked at the authorization form for the $150,000. "Do not worry about a thing, sweetheart," I said. "The paperwork is on my desk right now. Consider the check in the mail. Have a beautiful wedding. You are the best dad. I love you. Goodbye, Stephanie." I hung up the phone. I placed the pen down. I took the bank authorization form, perfectly crisp and unsigned, and fed it directly into the shredder next to my desk. The machine whirred, tearing the paper into thin, useless strips. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully secured my fortune while discarding my presence. But they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had assumed that a man who spent 40 years navigating the brutal, unforgiving world of commercial construction would just roll over and accept a polite insult. They thought my rough hands meant a slow mind. I picked up the phone again, but this time I did not call Paris. I dialed the direct line to Gregory Marshall, my corporate attorney, a man as ruthless as he was loyal. Gregory had been by my side since my very first major real estate acquisition. He knew how to dig, and he knew how to ruin people legally. "Gregory," I said the moment he answered, "cancel the wire transfer for the wedding venue. Do not let a single dime leave my accounts." "Done," Gregory said, immediately sensing the cold shift in my voice. "Is there a problem, Harrison?" "There is a major problem," I said, turning my chair to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Chicago skyline. "And Gregory, I need you to do something else. Trace the first $150,000 I sent 3 months ago. I want to know exactly whose pockets my money lined. Tear their financial history apart right now. Leave absolutely nothing unchecked. I want answers before sunset. It seems I have been invited to a game, and I fully intend to be the one who ends it." I kept the phone pressed to my ear for a long moment after the line went dead. The silence in my office was absolute, broken only by the low, steady hum of the city traffic 14 stories below. I had spent 4 decades building a commercial real estate empire in Chicago. You do not survive in this city pouring concrete and negotiating with cutthroat developers without developing a radar for when you are being played. My gut had been whispering to me for 2 years, but I had ignored it because Stephanie was my daughter. I had wanted to believe she found a good man. I had wanted to believe the fairy tale she sold me. Now the illusion was shattered, leaving behind a cold, sharp reality. I leaned back in my desk chair and thought deeply about Bastian. Bastian had always presented himself as a highly successful art investor. He dressed in bespoke suits, wore a vintage watch that supposedly belonged to his grandfather, and spoke with an effortless arrogance that commanded attention. But as I sat there replaying every interaction we ever had, the inconsistencies began to pile up like unpaid invoices. In the 2 years they had been dating, I had never seen Bastian actually pay for a single meal. Every time the check arrived at some overpriced downtown restaurant, he would excuse himself to the restroom, or he would claim his international card had been temporarily frozen due to a sudden security alert. Stephanie always rushed to cover it, waving off his apologies with a bright, eager smile. He talked endlessly about his prestigious art acquisitions, tossing around the names of obscure French painters and exclusive gallery openings. Yet whenever I asked about his current portfolio or his profit margins, his answers were always a masterclass in elegant evasion. He would smile condescendingly, swirl his wine, and tell me that the European art market operated on heritage and relationships, not crude American balance sheets. He made it sound like discussing actual numbers was a vulgar habit only a laborer would have. I was a man who built skyscrapers from dirt and steel. I knew that whether you were selling abstract paintings or concrete blocks, business was business. Cash flow was cash flow. And his cash flow was completely invisible. The warning signs had been flashing right in front of my face. I remembered the time they flew back to Paris for the holidays. Stephanie had casually mentioned that they stayed at a boutique hotel because the family chateau was undergoing extensive historical renovations. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Old houses needed work. But now, filtered through the lens of that email and the hired security guards, the story felt different. It felt desperate. They were not renovating a grand estate. They were hiding something. Bastien was not an art investor. He was a parasite wearing a fancy suit, using a fake aristocratic pedigree to mask his empty pockets. And my daughter, blinded by her desperate desire to be part of the elite, was helping him pick my pocket. I turned my attention back to my desk. The shredded remains of the bank authorization form sat in the wastebasket, but I still had the original email from the wedding planner containing the specific wiring instructions for the final payment. I clicked the email open on my monitor and leaned in, my eyes scanning the fine print. When you wire $150,000 overseas, you expect to see the name of a reputable vendor, a premier catering group, a premium events company, or perhaps a luxury hospitality trust. Instead, I saw a string of numbers attached to an offshore account based in a tax haven. The beneficiary name was not a business. It read Maison Rousseau Heritage. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. This money was not going toward floral arrangements, champagne towers, or string quartets. It was not paying for a wedding reception. Maison Rousseau Heritage was a private family trust. Stephanie and Bastien were funneling my money directly into his personal family accounts. The wedding was nothing but an elaborate smokescreen, a theatrical production staged to justify extracting a massive sum of cash from a grieving father who only wanted to see his daughter happy. They had assumed I would simply glance at the amount, sign the paper, and hand it over to my accounting department like I had done with the first payment. They counted on my lack of interest in the microscopic details of wedding planning. They thought I would be so distracted by the emotional weight of giving away my only child that I would not notice I was being robbed blind. A slow, dangerous anger began to boil in my chest. It was not the loud, explosive anger of a younger man. It was the quiet, methodical fury of an old builder who realizes a contractor has poured a faulty foundation. When you find a crack in the foundation, you do not patch it with paint. You bring in the heavy machinery and you tear the whole thing down. I had given them everything. I had funded their lifestyle, paid for their luxury vacations, and agreed to finance a wedding that cost more than the first 3 houses I had ever lived in. And their repayment was to ban me from the premises and steal my money. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to Gregory Marshall. Gregory was a legal shark who had spent 30 years protecting my assets. He picked up on the first ring. "Gregory," I said, my voice as hard as cured concrete. "Halt the second wire transfer for the wedding. Lock it down completely. Do not let a single dime leave my accounts." "Done," Gregory replied instantly, his tone shifting into business mode. "Consider it stopped." "Is there a problem, Harrison?" "There is a major problem," I said, turning my chair to face the sprawling Chicago skyline. "And Gregory, I need you to do something else. Trace the first $150,000 I sent 3 months ago. The money, I was told, went to secure the chateau and the vendors. I want to know exactly whose pockets that money lined. Tracing international funds can take time, but I have people who bypass roadblocks," Gregory said. "What exactly are we looking for?" We are looking for fraud, I answered plainly. We are looking for a slush fund. The beneficiary name is Maison Rousseau Heritage. I want to know the financial health of the Rousseau family. I want to know their debts, their assets, and their liabilities. Tear their financial history apart right now. Leave absolutely nothing unchecked. I want answers before sunset. I will have my forensic accounting team on it within the minute, Gregory assured me. If they are hiding something, we will find it. They are hiding everything, I said quietly. It seems I have been invited to a game and I fully intend to be the one who ends it. I ended the call and put down the phone. They made their move. Now it was my turn. I waited in my office as the afternoon sun dipped below the Chicago skyline. The shadows stretched across my desk, matching the cold darkness settling in my chest. I did not pace. I did not throw my coffee mug against the wall. Panic and rage are luxuries for amateurs, and I had spent my entire life building an empire by remaining perfectly still when the pressure was highest. 2 hours and 14 minutes after I gave the order, my private line rang. It was Gregory. He did not bother with pleasantries. He was a man who billed by the minute and delivered results by the second. "Harrison," Gregory said, his voice flat and analytical, "you were right to halt the second wire. I had my team trace the routing numbers for the initial $150,000 you sent 3 months ago. The funds did not go to a wedding planner. They did not go to a catering company, a florist, or a hospitality vendor." "Where did it go, Gregory?" I asked. "It went directly to a distressed asset management division of a regional French bank," he replied. "The beneficiary Maison Rousseau Heritage is not a prestigious family trust. It is a holding company for a single heavily mortgaged residential property, the Chateau Rousseau. The money you sent was flagged as an emergency arrears payment to halt an active foreclosure proceeding. The bank was literally 3 days away from seizing the estate and locking the doors. Your daughter's wedding deposit bailed them out of bankruptcy." I closed my eyes and let the reality wash over me. The opulent stories of elite European pedigree, the condescending remarks about my working-class background, the supposed anxiety over my lack of refined etiquette. It was all a meticulously crafted illusion. Bastien was not a wealthy art investor, rubbing elbows with diplomats and royalty. He was a desperate broke man wearing a tailored suit, drowning in generational debt. His mother, Madame Genevieve, was not protecting her aristocratic reputation from an uncultured American. She was protecting her crumbling unpaid mansion from the repo man. The truth was sickeningly clear. They were entirely bankrupt. The Rousseau family had the title, the history, and the crumbling chateau, but they did not have a dime to their name. And Stephanie knew. My daughter had to know. She was using my hard-earned money to illegally bail out a fraudulent family just so she could buy herself a fake aristocratic title. She was quite literally purchasing a groom and a fancy last name with my bank account, and she was willing to banish me from the ceremony to ensure her new in-laws did not have to look at the man who was secretly financing their survival. She had sold out her own father for a mirage of prestige. "There is more," Gregory continued, breaking through my thoughts. I pulled a surface-level credit check on Bastien Rousseau. The man does not have a single legitimate corporate affiliation. His art investment firm is a registered shell company with zero reported revenue for the past 4 years. He has defaulted on multiple personal loans across Europe. The man is a financial ghost. "Thank you, Gregory," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I want you to prepare a comprehensive dossier on that mortgage. Find out exactly who holds the paper, what the outstanding balance is, and what their terms are for selling distressed debt to a third party. I want every legal avenue explored. Do not sleep until I have a clear path to that bank." "Harrison," Gregory asked, a hint of genuine concern creeping into his usually stoic voice. "What exactly are you planning to do?" "I am going to do what I do best," I replied. "I am going to manage my investments. I will call you from the air." I hung up the phone and walked out of my office. I drove straight to my penthouse. I did not pack a suit. I did not pack formal wear. I grabbed a small worn leather bag and quickly threw in a few comfortable shirts, dark jeans, and my oldest, most trusted work boots. The ones I used to wear when I was still inspecting concrete pours on the south side. If they wanted a blue-collar worker, they were going to get one. Before I left for the airport, I took out my phone. I needed to ensure Stephanie felt completely secure in her deception. I opened my photo gallery and scrolled back to a picture I had taken 3 years ago at a secluded lake cabin in Wisconsin. It showed a quiet, misty morning on the water, far removed from civilization. I attached the photo to a text message addressed to my daughter. "Just arrived at the lodge," I typed. "The cell service up here is terrible, so I might be unreachable for the next few days. The water is beautiful. Have a wonderful wedding week, sweetheart. I will be thinking of you." I hit send. Within 30 seconds, my phone buzzed with her reply. "Looks so peaceful, Dad. Have a great time relaxing. I am so stressed with the final wedding details, but Bastian and his mother are taking good care of me. Love you. Talk to you next week." I read her message, staring at the blatant lies glowing on the screen. She was probably sitting in the parlor of that bankrupt chateau, breathing a massive sigh of relief, thinking she had successfully neutralized the only threat to her fragile new world. She thought I was safely tucked away in a cabin thousands of miles from her aristocratic charade. I slipped my phone into my pocket, grabbed my passport, and headed for the door. I drove straight to the private aviation annex. My personal assistant had already arranged everything while I was packing. I walked across the tarmac and boarded a chartered first-class overnight flight. The flight attendant offered me a glass of champagne as I settled into my wide leather seat, but I declined. I asked for a black coffee instead. I needed a clear head. As the jet engines roared to life and the plane lifted off into the dark Chicago sky, I looked out the small window at the shrinking city lights below. I had spent my entire life building structures meant to last for generations. I understood the mechanics of load-bearing walls, the integrity of steel beams, and the absolute necessity of a solid foundation. You cannot build a castle on top of rotten wood and expect it to stand when the wind blows. Stephanie and Bastian had built their entire relationship on a foundation of deceit, entitlement, and stolen money. They had mistaken my quiet generosity for foolishness. They had mistaken my love for leverage. They wanted a wedding funded by a clueless American. They were about to get a hostile takeover orchestrated by a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. I leaned back in my seat, the hum of the aircraft vibrating through the cabin. The flight to Paris would take 8 hours. 8 hours to calculate my exact approach. 8 hours to plan the precise moment I would collect my due. The overnight flight to Charles de Gaulle Airport gave me ample time to strategize. I watched the flight map on the monitor, tracking my progress across the Atlantic, every mile bringing me closer to the epicenter of my daughter's deception. When we landed in Paris, the morning air was crisp and gray. I walked to the standard rental counter and paid cash for a modest gray Peugeot sedan. It was the kind of car that blends perfectly into the background of any European street. The drive from the airport to the Rousseau family estate took just over an hour. It was the same hyper-focused energy I used to feel walking onto a chaotic construction site, knowing I had to identify the structural failures before the whole project collapsed. I navigated through a sleepy, picturesque village characterized by cobblestone streets and centuries-old stone facades. According to the GPS, the Chateau Rousseau was located just on the outskirts of this town. I drove past the main entrance once without slowing down, taking a quick, sweeping glance at the property. I did not pull into the driveway. Instead, I drove another quarter-mile down the road, turned around, and found a small, unassuming cafe situated on a slight hill directly across from the estate's main gates. I parked my gray Peugeot between a delivery van and an old tractor. I walked into the cafe, ordered a black espresso, and took a seat at a small iron table by the front window. I raised the ceramic cup to my lips and allowed myself to truly look at the so-called aristocratic estate my daughter had deemed too magnificent for my blue-collar presence. From Stephanie's breathless descriptions, I had pictured a sprawling, immaculate palace out of a history book. What I saw instead was a monumental ruin clinging desperately to its former glory. The chateau was massive, built of pale stone that had likely been stunning a century ago, but now it was heavily stained with water damage and creeping black mold. The roof was a disaster. Large sections of the slate tiles were simply missing, exposing the underlying timber framing to the elements. The grand iron gates at the entrance were rusted and leaning heavily on their hinges, suggesting a failing foundation in the stone pillars supporting them. The sprawling lawns were entirely overgrown, choked with weeds and untamed brush that had clearly not seen a landscaper in years. The long, winding driveway was cracked and pitted with deep potholes. This was not a home of immense wealth and high society. This was a decaying financial sinkhole. It was a massive liability that required millions of dollars just to make it habitable. My first wire transfer of $150,000 had not gone to securing premium floral arrangements or reserving an elite jazz band. It had gone to a desperate attempt to patch a sinking ship. I sat there for over an hour watching the quiet, pathetic reality of the Rousseau estate. Not a single luxury vehicle came or went. There was no bustling staff, no elite society friends dropping by. Just past 10 in the morning, the heavy silence across the road was broken by the harsh grinding of gears. A large white commercial delivery box truck rumbled down the street and pulled up abruptly right in front of the rusted iron gates. Two men in work uniforms stepped out of the cab. They did not look like men arriving to happily deliver high-end wedding supplies. They looked agitated. They marched up to the intercom box on the stone pillar and pressed the button repeatedly, their body language aggressive and impatient. A few minutes later, the front door of the chateau opened. A figure walked hurriedly down the long, cracked driveway toward the gates. Even from a distance, I recognized the tailored suit and the arrogant posture. It was Bastien. He was not strolling with the effortless grace of a wealthy art investor. He was walking with the rapid, jerky steps of a man backed into a corner. When he reached the gates, he did not open them to let the men inside. Instead, he stood behind the wrought iron bars, gripping them with both hands. The distance between the cafe and the gates was perhaps 50 yards, and the morning air was remarkably still. The men were speaking loudly, their voices carrying across the quiet road. They were speaking French, a rapid, heated exchange. My daughter assumed I was just a Midwestern contractor who only knew how to order a beer in English. She had completely forgotten that my first major contracting jobs in my 20s had been supervising massive dam projects in rural Quebec and later in the French countryside. I spent 5 years immersed in the language. I knew the cadence, the slang, and the specific vocabulary of angry laborers demanding their wages. I leaned closer to the window, my eyes fixed on the altercation. The taller of the two delivery men was waving a clipboard frantically in Bastien's face, jabbing his finger at a stack of invoices. I could hear the sharp, biting consonants of his demands. He was refusing to unload a single chair, a single table, or a single bottle of wine until the past due balance was settled in full. He shouted that his company was not running a charity for broke nobles. Bastien's response was a masterclass in desperate humiliation. The smooth, patronizing tone he had used with me on the phone just 24 hours earlier was completely gone. His voice was shrill, pleading, and frantic. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, practically begging the delivery men for just a little more time. He pointed toward the chateau, then pointed toward the road, making wild, sweeping promises. And then his voice pitched loud enough to echo perfectly across the street, cutting through the crisp morning air like a siren. He screamed in French, "I need you to just leave the equipment today. I swear to you on my family name. The American money arrives tomorrow." I closed my eyes and let out a long, slow breath. The American money. That was what I amounted to in their eyes. Not a father, not a guest, not even a human being. I was simply the American money, a crude walking bank account meant to prop up the delusions of a decaying family. I opened my eyes and watched Bastien practically groveling at the gates. The delivery men, looking thoroughly disgusted, eventually threw their hands up in the air. They agreed to leave a fraction of the supplies, just enough to stage the main hall. Bastian nodded vigorously, a pathetic display of submission. I watched him help the men carry several large crates through the rusted gates. I took the last sip of my espresso. It was bitter and cold, exactly how I liked it. I placed a few euros on the table and stood up. I had seen everything I needed to see. The lie was entirely exposed. The facade was crumbling right in front of me. They were banking their entire existence on a wire transfer that was never going to come. I walked out of the small cafe, the morning chill biting at my coat. The cobblestone street was quiet. Bastian had retreated inside his decaying fortress, a rat scurrying back into the dark to await a bailout that did not exist. I crossed the street to my rented Peugeot, unlocking it with a sharp click. I sat in the driver's seat, leaving the engine off, staring at the rusted iron gates. A profound sense of vindication settled over me, replaced almost instantly by a heavy ache. My daughter was throwing her life away on a theatrical scam. I was still wrestling with the weight of that truth when my phone vibrated violently against my thigh. It was a secure line. Gregory. I answered it immediately, knowing my attorney rarely called unless he held a smoking gun. Harrison, Gregory said. His voice was unusually clipped, lacking its normal steady cadence. I have something you need to see, and I need you to brace yourself before you open it. I am sitting in my car outside a bankrupt chateau, Gregory, I replied. I just watched my future son-in-law beg delivery men for folding chairs because his pockets are empty. What did you find? My forensic team dug deep into the Rousseau family structure, Gregory explained. They are insolvent, but I instructed my contacts in Paris to pull any pending legal filings associated with Bastian or Stephanie. I wanted to see if there were any hidden liabilities before the marriage license was finalized. We bypassed a few standard channels to get it. Get to the point, Gregory, I said, a cold apprehension creeping down my spine. I just sent an encrypted file to your device, he said. It is an extremely predatory prenuptial agreement. Stephanie signed it 2 weeks ago in Paris. It was filed privately to avoid our corporate radar. A prenup? I asked. Why would she sign a prenup? She has no personal assets. Everything she has is derived from my holding companies and the allowance I provide. That is exactly the point, Gregory said grimly. Open the file. Look at page 14, section 4, paragraph B. I will stay on the line. I tapped the screen, entering the decryption key Gregory had provided. The document loaded. It was 50 pages of dense, convoluted French legal jargon, but Gregory had thoughtfully attached a certified English translation. I scrolled down to page 14, my thumb hovering over the glass. I found section 4. The header was labeled Future Asset Allocation and Estate Maintenance. I began to read the translated text. The legal terminology was dry, but the implications were sharp enough to draw blood. The clause stipulated that upon the legal finalization of the marriage, Stephanie agreed to combine all future inherited wealth into a joint European trust. But it was the specific trigger mechanism in paragraph B that made my breath catch in my throat. It explicitly detailed that upon the event of my death, a mandatory 40% of my entire estate, the wealth Stephanie was legally poised to inherit, would be automatically diverted and permanently locked into the Maison Rousseau Heritage Trust. The stated purpose for this massive diversion of funds was listed as mandatory historical preservation and generational maintenance of the Rousseau ancestral properties. I read the paragraph again, and then a third time. My vision tunneled. The air in the rental car suddenly felt thin and suffocating. This was not a standard clause to protect a family business. This was a calculated parasitic siphon. Stephanie had not just banned me from her wedding to save face in front of fake aristocrats. She had actively legally promised away almost half of my life's work to a family of impoverished leeches contingent on my death. She was monetizing my mortality to buy a crumbling mansion and a fraudulent title. The sheer mechanics of the betrayal were staggering. Bastian and his mother had clearly engineered this trap. They knew they could not extract millions from me while I was alive and watching the books. I was too careful, too involved. So they manipulated my desperate, status-obsessed daughter into signing a document that turned my eventual death into their ultimate payday. They were taking out a massive, highly profitable insurance policy on my life. "Are you reading it, Harrison?" Gregory asked, his voice breaking through the heavy silence in the car. "I am reading it," I whispered. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, hoarse, hollowed out. "It gets worse," Gregory added. "The penalty clause on page 20 states that if Stephanie attempts to contest this diversion of funds after your passing, she forfeits her entire stake in the joint marital assets. They have her boxed in completely. They saw a wealthy American mark, and they engineered a masterclass in wealth extraction." Harrison. "This document is a financial death warrant for your legacy. They are waiting for you to die so they can fix their roof and pay off their debts with the money you bled to earn." I gripped the steering wheel of the Peugeot, the leather digging into my palms. I thought of the 30 years I spent waking up at 4 in the morning to stand in freezing Chicago rain, inspecting structural steel and pouring concrete. I thought of the countless dinners I missed reviewing architectural blueprints, all to build an empire that would guarantee my family's security for generations. I did it for Martha. I did it for Stephanie. And this was the return on my investment. My daughter had sat in a posh Parisian lawyer's office and happily signed away my blood and sweat to a man she barely knew. She had essentially placed a bounty on my legacy to purchase a fairy tale that did not exist. The pain of the banishment email, the insult of the fishing trip, all of that paled in comparison to the cold, undeniable evil of this contract. The email was an insult to my pride. The prenuptial agreement was an assault on my entire existence. "Is it legally binding?" I asked. I needed to know the exact structural integrity of their trap before I destroyed it. "In France, yes," Gregory confirmed. "And since you are an American citizen with international holdings, enforcing it across borders would be a long, brutal legal war. But the real issue is that Stephanie willingly signed it. She consented to the diversion. If you pass away with your current will intact, transferring your primary assets to her, this French contract will trigger immediately. The money will flow out of Chicago and directly into the Maison Rousseau Heritage Trust before the ink on your death certificate is even dry. They found a legal loophole to drain my accounts from across the Atlantic." "It is a sophisticated grift," Gregory agreed. "What do you want me to do, Harrison?" "We can put everything into an ironclad domestic trust that she cannot touch. We can cut her off completely. We will address the will later," I said. "Right now, I need to address the immediate threat. They think they hold all the cards because they hold my daughter's signature. But a contract is only as powerful as the assets it targets. Their most pressing problem is not my eventual death. Their most pressing problem is their immediate survival." I looked out the window at the rusted gates of the chateau. The irony was poetic. They were waiting for my death to fix their crumbling estate, oblivious to the fact that I was parked 50 yards away, completely alive, and meticulously planning their ruin. "Gregory, you confirmed earlier that the bank holding their defaulted mortgage was prepared to seize the property within days. Is that correct?" "Yes. Banque Populaire de l'Est. They hold the primary note. The bank is highly motivated to offload the toxic asset before it requires further maintenance." "Good," I said, my voice hardening into a blade. "I do not want to wait for them to foreclose. I want to control the board. Contact the commercial asset division of that bank immediately. I want to buy the Rousseau mortgage directly from the bank. Offer them a 10% premium over the current outstanding debt to expedite the transaction. Do not negotiate. Pay whatever they demand to close it today." I watched the rusted iron gates of the chateau through the windshield of my rental car, the phone pressed against my ear. Gregory was silent for a fraction of a second, processing the sheer scale of the directive I had just given him. Buying distressed international debt in a matter of hours was not a simple clerical task. It required bypassing layers of strict European banking regulations, navigating complex legal frameworks, and deploying an overwhelming amount of liquid capital. But I did not build a commercial real estate empire by accepting the word impossible. I built it by knowing exactly which levers to pull and possessing the financial gravity to pull them hard. "I will initiate the transfer protocols immediately," Gregory finally said, his voice stripped of any hesitation. "I have a contact within the commercial asset division of Banque Populaire de l'Est, a senior executive who handles toxic portfolios. If we approach them through a corporate shell company and offer a premium on the outstanding balance, they will bypass the standard auction procedures. They want this non-performing loan off their books before the end of the fiscal quarter. Use the Luxembourg Holding Company." I instructed, my eyes tracking Bastian as he disappeared back into the crumbling manor. "Mask my identity completely. I do not want the Rousseau family, their lawyers, or the bank to know that an American is purchasing the paper. As far as the bank is concerned, this is just a faceless European investment group acquiring a distressed asset for redevelopment. Wire the funds as soon as the terms are drafted. Do not wait for standard business hours. Push it through the priority channels." "It will be an aggressive acquisition, Harrison," Gregory warned. "We are talking about a significant capital expenditure, and the underlying collateral is severely degraded. You are buying a ruin." "I am not buying a building, Gregory," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I am buying a guillotine. Just make sure the blade is sharp." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The interior of the gray Peugeot felt small and stifling, but I did not roll down the windows. I needed the quiet. I needed the isolation to maintain the cold, calculating focus that was currently keeping my rage in check. I stared at the sprawling, overgrown lawns of the estate, thinking about the sheer audacity of the people inside. They had looked at my life, my decades of sweat and sacrifice, and seen nothing but a resource to be harvested. They had engineered a trap that would siphon my wealth over my dead body, using my own daughter as the primary instrument of my destruction. The pain of that realization was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. I remembered Stephanie as a little girl running through the scaffolding of my early construction sites in an oversized hard hat, her eyes wide with admiration for the things her father was building. I remembered paying for her elite education, her lavish apartments, her endless array of expensive hobbies, always believing I was giving her the security I never had. I had shielded her from the brutal realities of the world, from the cutthroat nature of survival. And in doing so, I had raised a woman who was willing to sell my legacy to a family of parasites, just to play the role of a fake aristocrat. She had signed a document that essentially placed a bounty on my head. She had prioritized the crumbling roof of a French chateau over the life of the man who had given her everything. The emotional betrayal was profound, but in the world of business, emotion is a liability. You do not win wars by weeping over the damage. You win by systematically dismantling the resources of your enemy. And the Rousseau family had only one resource left, the walls hiding them from the real world. The hours dragged on with agonizing slowness. I left the car only once to walk down the cobblestone street and purchase a bottle of water from a small corner store, keeping my face turned away from the estate. I returned to my vantage point and watched the slow, pathetic rhythm of the chateau. A single battered van arrived to deliver what looked like discounted floral arrangements. Two women in faded uniforms spent an hour sweeping the front steps, their movements sluggish and uninspired. There was no grandeur here. There was only the desperate, frantic pantomime of wealth staged entirely for the benefit of a wealthy American father who they believed was currently fishing in a Wisconsin lake. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the French countryside, my phone illuminated the dim interior of the car. It was Gregory. I answered before the second ring. "The transaction is complete," Gregory announced, his voice carrying the unmistakable weight of victory. It required aggressive maneuvering and a substantial premium, but the bank was overwhelmingly eager to liquidate the asset. The commercial director bypassed the standard bureaucratic waiting periods the moment our holding company confirmed the wire transfer. "The funds have cleared their internal systems. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed intensely on the heavy wooden doors of the chateau. Confirm the legal status, Gregory. Leave absolutely no room for interpretation. The paperwork has been digitally signed and registered with the Regional Financial Authority, Gregory confirmed smoothly. The holding company you control now officially owns the entirety of the Rousseau family debt. We possess the primary mortgage, the secondary lines of credit secured against the property, and the overdue tax liens the bank had absorbed. We hold all of it, Harrison. The estate is completely encumbered by our corporate entity. What is the current status of the foreclosure proceeding? I asked, my pulse finally beginning to steady. Since we acquired the distressed debt, we inherit all the rights and privileges of the original lending institution. Gregory explained, the professional satisfaction evident in his tone. The previous bank was 3 days away from locking the gates. We now hold the authority to either halt that foreclosure or accelerate it. The entire property is essentially in default to you. You possess the legal right to demand immediate repayment in full, and when they inevitably fail to produce the capital, you have the right to seize the physical estate and evict the occupants without any further delays. I looked at the grand, rotting structure across the street. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of purple and bruised red. The lights inside the chateau began to flicker on, illuminating the dirty glass of the tall windows. They were likely sitting down to a modest dinner, congratulating themselves on their brilliant deception. They probably believed they had secured their future, laughing at the ignorant contractor who had funded their survival and signed away his own legacy. They thought they were untouchable aristocrats living in an ancestral fortress. Excellent work, Gregory, I said quietly, the dark satisfaction spreading through my chest like freezing water. Have the legal team draft the formal notice of immediate default. I will deliver it tomorrow. The next 24 hours moved with the deliberate precision of a ticking clock. I did not return to the chateau during daylight. I spent the day in a private suite at a discreet hotel in Paris, waiting for the legal documents to be finalized, stamped and officially sealed by the financial authority. Gregory was relentless. By late afternoon, a courier arrived at my door with a leather binder containing the undeniable proof of my absolute ownership over the Rousseau estate. I was no longer a discarded father or a naive American contractor. I was the master of their domain. As evening approached, I prepared myself for the rehearsal dinner. I did not pack fishing gear or a flannel shirt. I opened the garment bag I had instructed my assistant to forward and pulled out a flawless, custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. It was a suit designed for boardrooms and galas woven from blue wool with crisp black lapels. I dressed slowly, adjusting the silk bow tie and securing my cufflinks. I looked in the mirror. The man staring back was not an exhausted old man. He was a predator. I drove the rental car back to the village just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The Chateau Rousseau, which had looked pathetic and crumbling in the morning, was now masked by the forgiving shadows of the night. Warm golden light spilled from the dirty windows, casting an illusion of grandeur across the overgrown lawns. They had clearly spent the last of their borrowed credit on lighting and landscaping crews, who had hastily trimmed the hedges to hide the decay. The rusted iron gates were propped wide open, flanked by the very security guards Bastian had hired to keep me out. I bypassed the driveway entirely, parking my vehicle down the road and walking up the path on foot. The air was thick with the scent of perfume and roasted meat. I could hear the faint, lively tempo of a quartet drifting through the oak doors of the main hall. I stepped into the shadows near the entrance and observed the spectacle they had constructed with my stolen money. The hall was packed with 200 guests. Bastian had referred to these people as the Parisian elite diplomats and financiers who would judge my calloused hands. But looking at the crowd through the glass panes, I saw something different. I recognized the hungry, assessing eyes of creditors. These were local merchants, nobility clinging to old wealth, and bankers who had been invited to witness the spectacle of the Rousseau family's salvation. They were drinking champagne and eating caviar, but they were scanning the room like vultures waiting to see if the American money was real. And standing in the center of it all was my daughter. Stephanie was holding court near a massive stone fireplace, laughing brightly and sipping from a crystal flute. She was wearing a stunning pearl-white evening gown that shimmered under the chandeliers. I knew exactly how much that dress cost because the $20,000 charge had hit my credit card exactly 4 weeks ago. She looked beautiful, radiant, and fake. She was playing the role of the wealthy aristocratic bride, oblivious to the fact that her stage was built on a crumbling foundation of debt and deceit. I waited until Bastian stepped to the front of the room and tapped his glass with a silver spoon. The ringing sound brought the quartet to a halt. An anticipation settled over the crowd as Bastian wrapped his arm around Stephanie's waist, beaming with a manufactured pride. He began to speak in rapid French, thanking his guests for joining them to celebrate the union of two families. He spoke of heritage, of tradition, and of the prosperous future that lay ahead for the Chateau Rousseau. It was the perfect moment. I stepped out of the shadows and grasped the iron handles of the oak doors. I pushed them open with a forceful thrust. The heavy wood groaned loudly against the stone floors, sending an echoing boom through the cavernous hall. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. I stepped over the threshold and stopped standing in the center of the doorway. The golden light from the chandeliers caught the lines of my tuxedo. I did not smile. I did not speak. I let the weight of my presence fill the room. The reaction was instantaneous. Stephanie turned her head, the rehearsed smile plastered across her face. When her eyes locked onto mine, the blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her as pale as the gown she was wearing. Her mouth opened in a gasp. The champagne flute slipped from her fingers and shattered against the floor, the cracking sound echoing like a gunshot in the hall. Bastian flinched, his posture collapsing as his eyes widened in terror. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had snapped shut. For an agonizing moment, no one moved. The 200 creditors stared at me, their eyes darting between the American in the doorway and the groom at the front of the room. The illusion of their aristocratic superiority vanished, replaced by a suffocating panic. From the corner of the room, Madame Genevieve pushed her way through the crowd. Her face was flushed with an ugly shade of red. She was furious, her aristocratic poise dissolving into an expression of unadulterated rage. She stormed toward me, her heels clicking against the floor. Bastian recovered from his shock and scrambled after his mother, grabbing her arm in an attempt to hold her back. But Madame Genevieve yanked her arm away and marched into my space. She glared up at me, her chest heaving with indignation. She began to hiss in accented English, her voice vibrating with venom. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, pointing a finger toward the door. "You were told you were not welcome at this event. You are trespassing on family property. I demand that you leave this chateau immediately before I instruct my security to throw you out." I looked down at the desperate woman. I did not raise my voice. I did not break my posture. I reached inside the pocket of my tuxedo jacket and withdrew the folded legal document Gregory had prepared for me. I held it out toward her, keeping my eyes locked on hers. "Madame Rousseau," I said, my voice projecting across the hall so every creditor in the room could hear me, "I believe you are mistaken about the nature of this property." Bastian stepped forward, positioning himself between his mother and me, his hands raised. "Harrison, please," he stammered, his voice laced with dread. "We can discuss this. Let us go to my office." "We will discuss nothing in private, Bastian," I replied, my tone cutting through his plea. "I am not here to negotiate your surrender. I am here to deliver an eviction notice." Stephanie rushed forward, tears streaming down her face, her hands reaching out toward me. "Dad, stop it. You are ruining my life." I looked at my daughter, feeling nothing but cold resolve. "No, Stephanie," I said firmly. "I am simply protecting my investment." Madame Genevieve drew herself up to her full, unimpressive height. She looked at me not as a man, but as a stain on the marble floor of her ancestral home. The shock that had initially frozen her features melted away, replaced quickly by the haughty, ingrained arrogance of a woman who had spent her entire life believing her bloodline excused her empty bank accounts. She turned her back to me, dismissing my presence with a sharp flick of her wrist. She faced the sea of elegantly dressed creditors, local merchants, and curious onlookers who had gathered for the rehearsal dinner. She raised her hands, adopting the demeanor of a gracious host dealing with an unfortunate pest. When she spoke, her voice was loud, melodic, and entirely in French. She assumed, of course, that the crude Midwestern contractor standing behind her possessed the linguistic capacity of a brick. She offered a theatrical sigh and addressed the room. "My dear, esteemed guests," she announced, her tone dripping with mock sorrow. "Please accept my most profound apologies for this vulgar interruption. We seem to have experienced a minor breach in our perimeter security. An unwanted, uncultured beggar has wandered in from the street, likely confused by the lights and the music. We will have this unsightly mess cleared away momentarily, so that our beautiful evening may proceed without further offense to our sensibilities." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests cast uncomfortable glances in my direction, while others, perhaps the old money aristocrats who still bought into the Rousseau charade, offered sympathetic nods to the madame. Bastien, emboldened by his mother's aggressive posture, seemed to recover his nerve. The panic that had briefly paralyzed him vanished, replaced by a desperate, blustering bravado. He pointed a trembling finger at me and shouted in English, his thick accent cracking with panic. "You heard my mother. You are trespassing. Guards, remove this man from the premises immediately. Throw him out into the road where he belongs." The two hired security guards, the very men instructed to keep me out, stepped through the heavy oak doors. They were large, imposing men accustomed to handling unruly party crashers. They flanked me on either side, their hands reaching out to grab my shoulders. I did not flinch. I did not raise my fists or assume a defensive stance. I simply turned my head and looked at the guard on my left with an expression of such absolute, terrifying authority that he froze mid-step. I had spent 40 years commanding crews of ironworkers and masons on the most dangerous construction sites in Chicago. You do not survive that environment without learning how to stop a man dead in his tracks with nothing but a look. The guard lowered his hands, suddenly unsure of his mandate. Stephanie was weeping openly, now her hands covering her face, the $20,000 pearl-white gown shaking with her sobs. "Dad, please," she wailed, her voice echoing in the tense silence of the grand hall. "Just go. Please just walk away before this gets any worse. You are ruining the most important weekend of my life. Just leave." She was still clinging to the illusion, still hoping that if I walked out the door, the fairy tale could magically resume. She did not realize the fairy tale had already been foreclosed upon. I ignored her tears. I ignored Bastian's frantic gesturing. My eyes swept across the room, past the stunned faces of the catering staff and the whispering guests, until they landed on a sleek black microphone resting on a chrome stand near the string quartet. It was set up for the evening's toasts, positioned perfectly at the front of the room. Without a word to my daughter or her fraudulent fiancé, I began to walk. The crowd instinctively parted for me, stepping back to clear a path. My custom-tailored Tom Ford tuxedo caught the ambient light from the crystal chandeliers, radiating an aura of undeniable power that directly contradicted Genevieve's description of a street beggar. I walked with the slow, measured stride of a man who owned the very floorboards beneath his feet. I reached the microphone stand. I lifted the microphone from its cradle. The room was deathly quiet, every eye fixed upon me, waiting for the crude American to embarrass himself, to shout, to curse, to prove Madame Genevieve right. I held the cold metal in my hand and tapped the grill twice with my index finger. The hollow, echoing thud resonated from the speakers stationed around the massive hall, commanding absolute silence. I looked directly at Madame Genevieve, who was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed, a smug smile of anticipation resting on her thin lips. She was waiting for me to make a fool of myself in English. I raised the microphone to my mouth, took a slow, deep breath, and began to speak. I did not use English. I spoke in flawless, unaccented Parisian French. The words rolled off my tongue with the natural, rhythmic cadence of a native speaker, stripping away every assumption they had ever made about the uncultured Midwestern builder. The shock that hit the room was physical, a collective gasp that sucked the air out of the grand hall. Madame Genevieve's smug smile vanished instantly, her jaw dropping open in sheer, unadulterated horror. Bastien stumbled backward, as if he had been physically struck, his face turning the color of ash. What Stephanie never bothered to ask me, what she never cared to learn about the man who funded her existence, was the reality of my youth. Before I started my own company, before I poured the first concrete foundation in Chicago, I was a 22-year-old laborer desperate to make a name for myself. I spent 5 grueling years working on massive hydroelectric dam projects, first in the freezing wilderness of northern Quebec, and later on a specialized contract in the French Alps. I did not just learn the language, I lived it. I negotiated contracts in it, and I absorbed the culture from the dirt up. I knew the high society Parisian dialect just as well as I knew the rough slang of the local taverns. Stephanie never knew because she only cared about the wealth I possessed, never the history of how I acquired it. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said into the microphone, my French echoing with smooth, resonant authority. "I must apologize for the slight delay in the evening's festivities. Madame Rousseau is quite correct. There has been a breach of security tonight. However, the breach is not my presence. The breach is the staggering mountain of lies you have all been fed by the very people hosting this dinner. I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. I welcome all of you to this magnificent chateau, to this beautiful rehearsal dinner, and to this lavish celebration. I point my hand to the expensive flowers, the vintage wine, the hired string quartet, the useless security guards, and the designer gown. I am the clueless American construction worker footing the entire bill for this fraudulent family's desperate, pathetic daily survival. I let the microphone pick up the heavy, suffocating silence following my words. The grand hall, which had been buzzing with polite laughter and the clinking of crystal just moments before, was now as quiet as a tomb. I looked out, meeting the shocked stares of local merchants, the confused glares of the remaining aristocrats, and the absolutely paralyzed expressions of my daughter and her groom. I took a deliberate step forward, bringing the microphone closer to my mouth, and let my flawless French carry the absolute truth into every dark corner of the room. "You see," I began, my voice remarkably steady and completely devoid of the Midwestern accent they had eagerly mocked. My daughter Stephanie believed she was marrying into a dynasty of immense wealth and unparalleled prestige. She desperately believed she was firmly securing a bright future among the European elite. And Bastien, along with his deeply charming mother, Madame Genevieve, did absolutely everything in their power to cultivate that specific illusion. They spoke of vast art portfolios and historic chateaux. They turned up their noses at my rough hands and American money, claiming it was entirely too vulgar. But the reality tells a far more pathetic story. I gestured toward the lavish spread of food and the towering floral arrangements that adorned the dining tables. "Everything you see perfectly arranged here tonight. Every single ounce of premium champagne you are drinking. Every single delicate appetizer you are eagerly eating. And every incredibly expensive flower placed in this room was supposed to be fully paid for by my initial wire transfer. I sent exactly $150,000 across the Atlantic to ensure my daughter had the magical wedding of her wild dreams. I was told the funds were strictly required to securely book the absolute best high-end vendors in Paris. But that money did not go to a wedding planner. It did not go to a catering company. It went directly to the distressed asset division of the regional French bank. A sharp, sudden gasp echoed from the back of the crowded room. I kept my eyes locked on Madame Genevieve, watching the blood drain from her powdered face. She looked as though she might faint, but I offered her absolutely no quarter. "Yes," I continued, my voice ringing with authority. "The proud Rousseau family is bankrupt. They are drowning in generational debt, clutching a crumbling mansion they cannot afford to heat. My initial deposit was seized by their bank to halt an active foreclosure proceeding on this very estate. If I had not sent that money, the locks on those rusted gates outside would have been changed 3 days ago, and Madame Genevieve would be pitching a tent on the sidewalk. They used my daughter to bail themselves out. I turned my gaze toward the men and women hovering near the kitchen doors. To the hard-working vendors in this room, I announced, raising my voice to ensure perfect clarity. To the caterers, the florists, and the rental companies who worked tirelessly to make this evening look presentable. I know exactly how you were hired. I watched Bastian at the front gates this morning, practically begging delivery men to leave their equipment. He promised you that your outstanding invoices would be settled tomorrow. He swore on his family name that the American money was arriving in the morning. The room went dead silent. It was a thick, volatile silence pregnant with the undeniable realization of impending disaster. Then the murmuring rapidly began. It started as a frantic whisper among guests, a rapid exchange of shocked French as the local elite realized they were attending a party hosted by financial ghosts. The murmurs escalated into a chaotic symphony of pure outrage. Near the kitchen, the head caterer dropped a heavy silver serving tray onto a wooden table with a loud clatter. He marched forward, his face flushed with profound anger, pointing a shaking finger directly at Bastian himself. He began to shout, demanding to know if the American was telling the truth. The lead florist quickly joined him, her voice rising sharply above the murmurs as she demanded immediate payment for the thousands of imported roses. The elegant veneer of the rehearsal dinner shattered completely, replaced by the ugly reality of unpaid creditors realizing they had been scammed. Madame Genevieve desperately tried to intervene wildly, waving her hands and shouting for order, but her voice was drowned out by the rising tide of angry vendors. They forcefully surrounded the head table, aggressively holding up their printed invoices. They finally realized that the aristocratic grace of the Rousseau family was nothing but a deceptive shell designed to steal their honest labor. In the center of the swirling chaos, Stephanie collapsed into a velvet chair, burying her tearful face in her trembling hands. Her perfect designer gown pooled around her on the stone floor like a sadly deflated parachute. She was sobbing uncontrollably, finally understanding the catastrophic magnitude of her foolish betrayal. She had traded her loving father for a shimmering mirage. Bastian, however, did not peacefully collapse. The humiliating exposure of his pathetic reality did not bring him to his knees. Instead, it powerfully ignited a desperate, highly vicious rage. The cultured Parisian gentleman instantly vanished, completely replaced by a frantic con artist. He violently shoved his way past the angry head caterer, his pale face painfully contorted in absolute fury. His aristocratic mask was permanently gone. He furiously stormed toward me, his shaking hands balled into extremely tight fists at his sides. He abruptly stopped just a few short feet from the metal microphone stand, his chest heaving. He aggressively screamed at me in English, his voice raw. "You have absolutely no right to do this!" Bastian roared, angry spittle flying from his trembling lips. "You ignorant, selfish old man, you do not understand how things work here. You are ruining everything. We had an agreement. Stephanie signed the authorization. You promised us the funds. I demand that you fulfill your strict obligation. I demand my second wire transfer right now." He stood there heavily panting, surrounded by the furious murmurs of his unpaid creditors, entirely blinded by his own toxic entitlement. He actually believed that by merely screaming loud enough, he could somehow force the wealthy American to open his deep, endless wallet and immediately save him from ruin. He genuinely believed he was still rightfully owed all of my hard-earned money. I did not back away. I stood my ground, tightly gripping the microphone stand, my expression cold and completely unyielding as the brutal Chicago winter. I looked him dead in the eye, piercing his pathetic, crumbling bravado. I simply spoke with a quiet, lethal precision that carried far more lasting weight than any shout ever could. I successfully canceled it, I stated smoothly, letting the heavy words hang suspended in the tense air. I strictly instructed my elite attorneys to completely halt the second $150,000 wire transfer exactly 48 hours ago. The promised money never left Chicago. The pending funds have been permanently revoked. His mouth wide opened, but absolutely no sound physically came out of his throat. The furious, burning red flush in his cheeks instantly vanished, leaving him a sickly, ghostly, pale white. He blankly stared at me, his eyes visibly wide with the sudden, horrifying realization that his entire carefully crafted world was rapidly and permanently collapsing right before him. "You do not currently have a single dime." I calmly continued, my steady voice echoing loudly and clearly through the silent, utterly captivated hall. "You possess absolutely no bridal deposit. You maintain completely no hidden slush fund. You have absolutely zero American money arriving tomorrow morning to miraculously save you from the severe consequences of your own actions. You are completely and utterly broke." The heavy silence that followed my declaration pressed down on the grand hall like a physical weight. Bastian stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing, as if he were gasping for air that was no longer there. The realization that his financial lifeline had been completely severed paralyzed him. He had placed all his desperate hopes on my supposed ignorance, and now standing before his unpaid creditors, the reality of his total ruin was undeniable. The murmurs of the local merchants, the caterers, and the florists shifted from confused outrage to a predatory focus. They realized that the aristocratic groom was nothing more than a hollow shell incapable of honoring a single debt he had incurred. Madame Genevieve, however, possessed a different kind of desperation. Her survival mechanism was not paralysis, but a venomous, deeply ingrained arrogance. She could not comprehend that a man with dirt beneath his fingernails had outmaneuvered a lineage that spanned centuries. She pushed her trembling son aside, her silk evening gown rustling violently as she marched toward me. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, her breath coming in sharp, shallow rasps. "You disgusting, insolent savage!" she hissed, her French vibrating with an intense, furious energy. "You come into my home, my ancestral estate, and you dare to speak to us in this manner. You dare to embarrass my family in front of our esteemed guests. This is a private residence, and you are a trespasser of the lowest order. I do not care what lies you have concocted in your pathetic common mind. We are the Rousseaus. We belong here. You belong in the mud." She turned her head, fixing her furious gaze on the two large security guards who had previously flanked me. They were still standing near the entrance, looking entirely bewildered by the unfolding drama. "What are you standing there for?" she screamed at them, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I am the lady of this chateau. I command you to seize this man, throw him out into the street, and someone call the local authorities immediately. I want this man arrested for trespassing, for harassment, and for disturbing the peace. Call the police right now. We will see how your American arrogance holds up in a French jail cell." The security guards shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uncertain glances. They were hired muscle paid to manage unruly wedding guests, not to arrest a man radiating such absolute terrifying calm. Several guests in the crowd began to reach for their cellular phones, the prospect of police involvement adding a frantic, chaotic energy to the room. Stephanie was openly weeping now, burying her face against the velvet upholstery of the chair, entirely unable to watch the complete annihilation of her fabricated fairy tale. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I let Madame Genevieve finish her hysterical tirade. I waited until the echoes of her screaming faded into the vast vaulted ceilings of the hall. The room was holding its collective breath, waiting for my response, waiting to see if the American would finally break under the threat of law enforcement. I slowly reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. My movements were deliberate, unhurried, and precise. My fingers brushed against the thick, heavy parchment of the legal documents Gregory had couriered to my hotel suite just a few hours prior. I withdrew the folded papers, the crisp white sheets standing out starkly against the dark blue wool of my jacket. I held them in my right hand, feeling the raised seals of the Regional Financial Authority pressed into the corner of the pages. "Madame Rousseau," I began, my voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried effortlessly across the silent room. "I highly encourage you to call the local police. In fact, I insist upon it. I would be more than happy to speak with the authorities tonight. However, when they arrive, they will not be placing me in handcuffs for trespassing on private property. They will be actively assisting me in removing a family of illegal squatters from my newly acquired real estate. Madame Genevieve stopped breathing. Her outstretched finger slowly lowered the furious red flush of her cheeks, completely draining away, leaving her skin a sickly pallid gray. Bastien let out a low, pathetic whimper, his eyes locked onto the folded documents in my hand. I took a slow, measured step forward, closing the distance between myself and the trembling matriarch. I held up the paperwork, ensuring that she, Bastien, and the surrounding crowd of unpaid creditors could clearly see the official banking seals and the bold, undeniable signatures. You assumed I was a foolish man. I continued, my tone smooth, relentless, and perfectly calibrated to inflict maximum psychological damage. You assumed I would blindly finance your salvation because my daughter desperately wanted to play the role of a princess. But you made a catastrophic miscalculation. You underestimated my profound capacity for diligence. When I discovered that my initial $150,000 wire transfer was deliberately diverted to halt the active foreclosure proceeding on this very estate, I did not simply cancel the remaining wedding funds. I decided to fully manage my investment. I paused, letting the devastating reality of my words sink into their terrified minds. The absolute silence in the grand hall was deafening. Yesterday afternoon, I utilized a corporate holding company based in Luxembourg. I explained, projecting my voice so every single merchant and vendor could hear the final nail being driven into the Rousseau coffin. Through that anonymous entity, I aggressively purchased the entirety of your distressed debt directly from Banque Populaire de Paris. I paid a substantial premium to acquire the primary mortgage, the secondary lines of credit, and every single overdue tax lien associated with this property. The bank was absolutely thrilled to liquidate your toxic, non-performing loans. Madame Genevieve began to shake. Her knees visibly trembled, and she gripped the edge of a nearby dining table to prevent herself from collapsing onto the stone floor. She was staring at me with a look of absolute, unmitigated horror, recognizing the inescapable finality of her situation. The legal transfer of assets was officially finalized and registered with the Regional Financial Authority just 3 hours ago. I stated, my voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. I hold the primary note. I control the debt. This crumbling mansion no longer belongs to the Rousseau family. I bought your defaulted mortgage. I own this chateau. The sheer magnitude of the revelation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Stephanie let out a choked, devastated sob, finally comprehending that she had traded her loving father for a family that did not even own the roof over their heads. Bastien dropped to his knees, his hands covering his face in utter defeat. The aristocratic illusion was entirely eradicated, shattered into a million irreparable pieces by a simple stack of legal papers. I looked down at Madame Genevieve, who was weeping silently, her manicured nails digging desperately into the wooden table. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property. The pronouncement hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. For a fleeting second, the grand hall of the Chateau Rousseau was perfectly still, trapped in the amber of a total aristocratic collapse. Then the reality of my words broke the spell. The head caterer, a stout man with a fiercely waxed mustache, did not wait for Madame Genevieve to offer a defense she did not possess. He simply turned his back on the weeping matriarch, raised a silver whistle to his lips, and blew a sharp, piercing note that cut through the lingering shock. That single sound was the death knell for the Rousseau family charade. He barked a series of rapid commands to his serving staff in harsh, guttural French. The elegant facade of a high-society dinner evaporated instantly. Waiters and waitresses who had been standing with polite, invisible grace just moments before transformed into a highly efficient reclamation crew. They moved with aggressive speed. A young man in a crisp white shirt reached across a table of stunned guests, seized a massive silver platter of imported caviar, and swiftly marched back toward the kitchen doors. Another waitress began unapologetically pulling crystal champagne flutes from the hands of the bewildered local merchants, emptying the expensive vintage directly into a plastic bucket she carried on her hip. They were taking back their labor ounce by ounce. The lead florist, her face a mask of furious determination, signaled her team. They descended upon the grand dining tables like a swarm of locusts. They did not gently dismantle the breathtaking towering centerpieces of white roses and rare orchids. They grabbed the glass vases by their bases, violently yanking the arrangements into the air, scattering damp petals and dirty water across the pristine white linen tablecloths. The beautiful, fragrant illusion of limitless wealth was being physically ripped apart in front of 200 witnesses. The string quartet seated near the great stone fireplace required no further instruction. The cellist forcefully unbuckled his instrument, his face tight with professional disgust. The violinists rapidly snapped their cases shut, the harsh clicks echoing loudly over the sounds of clattering silver and breaking glass. They slung their instruments over their shoulders and marched toward the exit in a tight, unyielding formation, not sparing a single glance for the weeping bride or the paralyzed groom. The panic that had been simmering among the invited elite finally boiled over into a full, undignified stampede. These were people who thrived on the proximity to wealth and status, and the sudden stench of absolute poverty repulsed them. The local politicians, the minor nobility, and the ambitious financiers realized simultaneously that they were standing in a sinking ship, associating with a family of exposed frauds. They realized their own reputations would be instantly tarnished if they were caught attending a party funded by stolen money. They did not pause to offer condolences to Madame Genevieve. They did not attempt to comfort my sobbing daughter. Instead, they immediately focused entirely on securing their own rapid departure from this monumental disaster. They moved as a singular frantic entity toward the heavy oak doors. Chairs screeched harshly against the stone floor as men in tailored suits abruptly stood up, practically dragging their wives by the arms. The appalled, hushed murmurs morphed into a loud, buzzing cacophony of desperate excuses and blatant insults. I stood near the center of the hall, entirely unmoving like a stone pillar in the middle of a rushing river. The fleeing guests actively avoided my gaze, giving me a wide berth as they scrambled for the exit. They bumped into one another, completely abandoning their refined manners in their desperate haste to escape the toxic fallout. Several guests carelessly trampled over the fallen flower arrangements, their expensive leather shoes loudly crushing the delicate white roses into the dirty stone floor without a single second of hesitation. A prominent local banker, a man Bastian had fawned over just an hour prior, forcefully shouldered past the groom, muttering a vile curse under his breath. Within minutes, the grand hall was stripped of its audience. The bustling, vibrant rehearsal dinner was reduced to a trashed, chaotic wasteland. Half-empty plates of cold food sat abandoned on stained tablecloths. Wilted flower petals littered the damp stone floor. The only sounds remaining were the aggressive clattering of the catering staff loading their delivery trucks outside, and the pathetic, ragged gasps of Madame Genevieve. She had sunk onto a velvet dining chair, her hands clutching her chest as she stared blankly at the ruined remnants of her ancestral pride. She was a queen without a kingdom, sitting in the ruins of a castle she no longer owned. I turned my attention to the room. Stephanie was still crouched on the floor, her magnificent $20,000 gown absorbing the spilled wine and dirty water left behind by the retreating florists. She looked up at Bastien, her face streaked with black mascara, her eyes pleading for a shred of the romantic devotion he had continuously promised her. She reached a trembling hand toward him, seeking the comforting embrace of the man she had betrayed me to marry. But Bastien did not kneel beside her. He did not offer a soft word of reassurance or a protective hand. The charming, sophisticated aristocrat was dead, completely replaced by a cornered, vicious opportunist whose final gamble had spectacularly failed. He looked down at my daughter, and his face contorted into a mask of pure, naked disgust. He violently slapped her outstretched hand away. The sharp, smacking sound echoed brightly in the desolate, hollow hall. Stephanie recoiled, a fresh sob tearing from her throat. Bastien loomed over her, his voice dropping into a harsh, cruel sneer. He no longer cared about playing the devoted lover. He only cared about his own absolute ruin. He aggressively pointed a shaking finger at her tear-stained face, his words dripping with unfiltered venom. "You stupid, useless girl! He spat, his English harsh and unforgiving. You told me he was a simpleton. You promised me he would simply sign the checks and stay completely out of our way. You swore your father was a compliant bank account, and instead, he is the man who just legally stole my entire family estate. Stephanie choked on a sob, helplessly shaking her head. Bastian sneered, stepping back from her, as if her very presence was physically repulsive. You are absolutely nothing to me without his money, he shouted, his voice echoing brutally against the stone walls. You have absolutely no title, no breeding, and no actual value. You were simply a pathetic means to a very specific end, and you have completely failed. You are utterly worthless. Bastian turned his back on his weeping bride. He did not look back. He aggressively marched across the debris-covered floor, grabbed his mother by her trembling arm, and forcefully dragged the broken woman out of the grand hall. They disappeared into the dark, empty corridors of the chateau, leaving Stephanie entirely alone. I stood absolutely perfectly still, watching my daughter violently weep in the center of the vast, ruined ballroom, surrounded by the shattered, dirty remains of her stolen fairy tale. The massive crystal chandeliers above us seemed to cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the absolute wreckage of the grand hall. The panicked echoes of the fleeing Parisian elite had completely faded into the night air, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy against my skin. The only sound remaining in the cavernous space was the ragged, desperate intake of breath from my daughter. Stephanie remained huddled on the stone tiles, the pristine white fabric of her $20,000 gown now soaked with spilled champagne and stained with crushed white roses. She looked small, entirely stripped of the haughty arrogance she had worn like armor since the moment she demanded I pay for this charade. I watched the profound realization wash over her tear-streaked face. The manicured hands that Bastian had violently swatted away were now gripping the ruined layers of her skirt. She finally understood the truth of her situation. She had eagerly discarded a father who spent his entire life building an empire to protect her, trading my unconditional devotion for a calculated grifter who only ever saw her as a convenient key to my bank accounts. The crushing weight of that bargain was visibly pressing her into the floorboards. She slowly lifted her head to look at me. Her makeup was ruined, leaving dark, smudged trails down her pale cheeks. For a brief second, I saw the little girl who used to run to me whenever she scraped her knee, the child who instinctively knew her father could fix any broken thing in her world. But then, the practiced mechanics of her lifelong manipulation kicked in. I recognized the specific shift in her eyes, the sudden, deliberate amplification of her sobs. These were the exact same desperate tears she had weaponized since she was a teenager, the calculated weeping she used whenever she wrecked a luxury car or overdrawn a credit card, fully expecting me to instantly open my wallet and make the consequences disappear. She did not simply stand up and face me with dignity. She dragged herself across the damp, debris-covered stone floor. She literally crawled toward me, the heavy, ruined fabric of her designer gown dragging behind her like a discarded parachute. She reached out with trembling hands and wrapped her fingers tightly around the crisp fabric of my tuxedo trousers, pulling herself up until she was kneeling at my feet. "Daddy, please!" she wailed, her voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch that echoed loudly against the empty stone walls. "Please, you have to fix this. You have to make this right. I made a terrible mistake. I know I was awful to you, but you cannot just leave me like this. You cannot let them throw me out into the street." Bastian lied to me. He manipulated me. He told me that contract was just a standard family protocol. I did not understand what I was signing. "You have to believe me." I looked down at the top of her head, feeling an unnatural, freezing calm settle deep within my chest. I did not reach down to stroke her hair. I did not offer a comforting hand to pull her up from the floor. I stood perfectly still, letting her desperate pleas break against the unyielding wall of my resolve. "Please, Daddy," she begged, her grip on my trousers tightening frantically as fresh tears poured down her face. Just reinstate the wire transfer. You have the money. It is nothing to you. Just pay the bank, clear the debt, and give them the chateau. If you give them the money, Bastien will come back. He will apologize. We can still have the wedding. We can pretend none of this terrible night ever happened. You can save my life right now. Please, Daddy, you have to save my life. I have absolutely nothing left." Her words poured out in a frantic, pathetic rush, completely devoid of any genuine remorse for the monstrous betrayal she had actively engineered against me. She was not crying because she had deeply hurt her father. She was crying because her golden ticket had been abruptly cancelled, and the handsome prince had just openly called her worthless. She was begging me to purchase a man who despised her, demanding that I voluntarily trigger the very financial trap they had set for me, just so she could desperately cling to an illusion that had already shattered. She wanted me to surrender my dignity, my hard-earned wealth, and my self-respect to buy back a groom who had literally run away the moment the cash flow stopped. "You cannot do this to your own daughter." Stephanie continued to sob, her voice growing increasingly ragged and breathless. "You have always protected me. You always promised you would take care of me. What will my friends say? What will everyone in Chicago think when they find out the wedding was canceled because my father refused to pay the bills? You are humiliating me in front of the entire world. Just make the call, Daddy. Call your bankers. Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell them you are authorizing the funds. I will do whatever you want. I will come back home after the honeymoon. I will be the perfect daughter. Just please do not let my life end like this." I listened to her hollow transactional promises, realizing with absolute terrifying clarity that the daughter I thought I had raised did not actually exist. The woman weeping at my feet was a stranger who viewed my unconditional love as a limitless currency to be spent on her endless vanity. She truly believed my role in the universe was to quietly absorb her blatant disrespect and continuously fund her increasingly destructive choices. Even now, sitting in the literal ruins of her catastrophic deceit, she could only focus on the social embarrassment. She could only focus on what her superficial friends would whisper behind her back, completely ignoring the fact she had happily signed a prenuptial agreement designed to steal my life's work over my dead body. She was asking me to fund the very people who had actively preyed upon her monumental foolishness. She wanted me to reward Bastien for his vicious cruelty simply because she was too terrified to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real world without a heavy shield of my money, protecting her from every single consequence. Bastien did not mean what he said. Stephanie pleaded frantically, trying to rewrite the brutal history that had occurred just 5 minutes prior. "He is just terribly stressed. His family has been under so much horrific pressure from the banks. They were desperate, Daddy. They just needed a little bit of help to save their heritage. If you give them the chateau, he will respect you. You cannot blame him for trying to secure his family's survival. You have to forgive him, Daddy. Just call the bank right now." She looked up at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, practically vibrating with a desperate, pathetic hope that I would magically revert to the compliant, generous father she had successfully manipulated for her entire adult life. I looked down at the woman weeping on the cold stone floor, her tears pooling in the ruined fabric of her designer gown. For 30 years, those tears had been the most effective currency she possessed. They had bought her luxury cars, exotic vacations, and a life entirely insulated from consequence. She was deploying them now with the desperate, frantic energy of a gambler throwing their last chips onto the table. But the table was gone. The game was completely over. I felt a profound, chilling calmness spread through my veins, permanently freezing the last lingering embers of paternal guilt. There was no anger left in my heart. There was no burning rage. There was only the cold, hard clarity of a man who had finally recognized a terrible investment and was permanently closing the ledger. Bastien did not mean what he said. She repeated, her voice a hollow, pathetic echo in the vast, empty hall. "He just needs the money, Daddy. Please." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to make the absolute finality of my decision clear. I looked at her without a single shred of pity. "You are still refusing to see the truth, Stephanie," I said, my words dropping like heavy stones into the silence of the room. "You are still desperately begging me to purchase an illusion. Bastian meant exactly what he said to you. He showed you his true face the exact moment my wallet snapped shut. He does not love you. He never loved you. He loved the holding companies and the massive trust funds I meticulously built. You were absolutely nothing more than a highly profitable acquisition, and you eagerly facilitated the merger because you were entirely too arrogant to realize you were being played." She flinched, as if I had physically struck her violently, shaking her head in frantic denial, but I did not stop. I needed to dismantle the remaining architecture of her toxic entitlement so completely that it could never possibly be rebuilt. "You sat in a lawyer's office in Paris." I continued, my tone completely level and devoid of any lingering emotion. "You happily signed a document that explicitly arranged for the legal theft of my life's work. You placed a bounty on my legacy to comfortably buy your way into a family of impoverished parasites. You sent me a disgraceful email banning me from your wedding because you were deeply ashamed of the hands that poured the concrete to build your trust fund. You told me my presence would profoundly embarrass you in front of these so-called elite aristocrats." I took a slow, deliberate step back, physically removing myself from her desperate grasp. "Now your own terrible actions have embarrassed you." I stated the unyielding truth of the statement hanging heavy in the cool night air of the Grand Hall. "You personally engineered this disastrous situation. You actively chose to trade a father who loved you unconditionally for a deceitful con artist who only wanted my wealth. You made a terrible calculating bargain, and you spectacularly lost. I will not shield you from the brutal consequences of your own vicious betrayal. I will not reinstate the international wire transfer. I will not pay a single additional dime to the bank. And I will absolutely not surrender this historic estate to a fraudulent family that actively plotted to drain my financial accounts over my dead body." Stephanie stared up at me, her red eyes wide with a horrified, dawning comprehension. The agonizing realization that her tears were completely ineffective was finally paralyzing her entirely. "I am not your bank," I said, delivering the final crushing blow. "And I am no longer your safety net." She did not scream loudly. She did not formulate another pathetic plea. She simply collapsed forward, her beautiful face pressed against the cold, damp stone tiles, her shaking body racked with silent, defeated sobs. The beautiful, confident woman who had cruelly sneered at my Midwestern roots was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of utter vanity and immense regret. I looked at her one last time, feeling a strangely detached sense of mourning for the daughter I falsely thought I knew, mixed with the profound, undeniable relief of finally shedding a deeply parasitic burden. I turned my back on her forever. I did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. I walked purposefully toward the massive, heavy oak doors of the silent chateau, the crisp sound of my leather shoes steadily echoing against the ancient floorboards was the only noise remaining in the desolate, ruined room. I stepped over the trampled, ruined white roses and pushed the heavy wooden doors open, stepping out of the suffocating atmosphere of the grand hall and into the crisp, biting chill of the French night. The air outside tasted remarkably sharp and wonderfully clean. The sprawling, manicured lawns were completely swallowed by the deep darkness, and the distant sounds of the fleeing creditors' vehicles had completely faded away into nothingness. The vast estate was totally dead, a silent tomb waiting for its new owner to legally decide its ultimate fate. I walked down the long, winding gravel driveway, permanently leaving the Chateau Rousseau behind me. I did not cast a single fleeting glance over my shoulder to observe the tragic wreckage of my daughter's foolish artificial ambition. I finally reached the rented gray Peugeot parked quietly down the narrow cobblestone street. I unlocked the sturdy doors with a sharp electronic click, the familiar sound instantly grounding me in the immediate reality of the present moment. I smoothly slid into the driver's seat, the dark leather feeling strangely comforting and highly familiar after such a chaotic, emotionally draining evening. I inserted the metal key into the ignition and powerfully started the engine, the low steady hum of the motor breaking the quiet stillness of the rural village. I turned the steering wheel and slowly guided the heavy vehicle away from the rusted iron gates, pointing the bright headlights toward the dark winding highway that led straight back to Paris. As the crumbling, pathetic silhouette of the stone chateau faded entirely from my rearview mirror, a truly remarkable sensation slowly began to wash over my exhausted body. The heavy, suffocating pressure that had been aggressively pressing down on my chest for agonizing weeks completely evaporated without a trace. The bitter sting of parental betrayal, the agonizing weight of perceived failure, and the furious anger of being ruthlessly exploited all simply dissolved into the cool night air rushing past my open window. I felt a profound sense of absolute liberation. I had spent 30 exhausting years carrying the immense weight of an international empire, constantly building massive walls of absolute security to protect a daughter who ultimately despised the very bricks I laid. I carried her endless entitlement, her toxic arrogance, and her relentless greedy demands like a very heavy rusted anchor around my neck. Now that heavy anchor was finally severed forever. I was swiftly driving away from a catastrophic disaster I did not create happily, leaving behind the tragic wreckage of a completely fraudulent life I absolutely refused to finance. 3 weeks later, the biting wind of a Chicago autumn whipped across the observation deck of my downtown office. The sprawling skyline of glass and steel stretched out before me, a testament to decades of relentless labor and uncompromising focus. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the decaying stone and fraudulent grandeur of the French countryside. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the city move, holding a mug of dark roast coffee. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for months was completely gone. In its place was a cold, enduring clarity. The operation I had set into motion that night in Paris had concluded with absolute clinical precision. Gregory sat at the long mahogany conference table behind me, reviewing the final stack of translated legal documents. The foreclosure process on the Chateau Rousseau had been swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. Without the steady influx of my American capital to artificially inflate their existence, the Rousseau family possessed absolutely no mechanism to halt the inevitable. The French banking authorities, thoroughly satisfied by the aggressive premium my holding company had paid, offered the disgraced aristocrats zero leniency. When the 24-hour grace period I verbally issued at the rehearsal dinner expired, Gregory immediately activated the acceleration clause. The eviction was executed under the strict supervision of local law enforcement. Madame Genevieve and Bastien were physically removed from the premises, forced to pack whatever meager personal belongings they could carry into a hired transport van, while the local villagers watched the final collapse of their noble facade. The iron gates were padlocked with heavy industrial chains. The property was immediately transferred into the sole possession of my corporate entity. Yesterday morning, we officially placed the chateau on the open international real estate market. We listed it at a highly aggressive, discounted price, intentionally targeting developers looking for historic rehabilitation projects. The goal was not to turn a massive profit. The singular objective was to swiftly liquidate the physical asset and completely recoup the initial $150,000 wire transfer that Bastien had stolen to stave off his ruin. Once that specific ledger was balanced, the Rousseau family would be entirely erased from my financial history, reduced to a minor resolved accounting error. The professional cleanup was remarkably straightforward. The personal fallout required a different kind of discipline. My private cellular phone rested silently on the edge of the conference table. The screen remained dark. Over the past 21 days, the device had registered exactly 36 missed calls from Stephanie. The corresponding voicemail messages traced a rapid, pathetic descent through the various stages of manufactured grief. The initial messages were filled with shrill, entitled anger, aggressively demanding that I answer the phone and fix the catastrophic social embarrassment I had caused. When the anger failed to elicit a response, the tone abruptly shifted to desperate weeping. She pleaded for a second chance. She claimed she had been brainwashed. She begged for a plane ticket, a hotel room, or a direct deposit to help her escape the horrifying reality of being stranded in a foreign country with a man who now actively despised her. I listened to every single message precisely once, and then I permanently deleted them. I did not return a single call. I did not send a single text. I had explicitly warned her that I was no longer her safety net, and I intended to enforce that boundary with absolute permanence. Without the endless flowing river of my wealth to cushion her existence, Stephanie was forcefully introduced to the brutal mechanics of the real world. Stripped of her platinum credit cards and her luxurious allowances, she was compelled to navigate her own survival. Gregory informed me through his international contacts that she had eventually managed to secure a flight back to the United States. She did not fly in the private first-class cabins she had grown utterly accustomed to demanding. She purchased a heavily discounted economy-class ticket, sitting in the cramped middle seat of a commercial airliner for 9 exhausting hours, carrying nothing but a single piece of luggage containing her ruined designer clothes. She returned to Chicago not as a conquering aristocratic princess, but as an ordinary adult forced to finally face the severe, undeniable consequences of her own destructive actions. She would have to find a modest apartment. She would have to secure standard employment. She would have to learn the actual value of $1 a lesson I should have firmly taught her 2 decades ago. "The final estate revisions are complete, Harrison," Gregory stated, breaking the quiet silence of the executive office. He slid a thick, bound portfolio across the polished wood of the table. "I have thoroughly dismantled every legal vulnerability they attempted to exploit." I turned away from the sprawling city view and approached the table. I picked up the heavy silver pen resting beside the documents. The revisions were comprehensive and devastatingly absolute. I systematically removed Stephanie as the primary beneficiary of my personal estate and my corporate holdings. I completely severed her access to the generational trust funds I had spent decades building. The carefully engineered, highly predatory prenuptial agreement she had so eagerly signed in that Parisian lawyer's office was now completely worthless. Bastian and his mother had meticulously crafted a trap designed to capture a massive fortune, but they had fundamentally failed to understand that the fortune was entirely dependent on my continued willing participation. By legally disinheriting my daughter, I successfully starved their parasitic contract of its vital oxygen. If I passed away tomorrow, the French trust would receive absolutely nothing but legally complex, entirely empty air. I firmly pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line, signing my name with a smooth, unbroken motion. The ink dried instantly, permanently sealing the massive vault of my legacy. A profound, enduring sense of peace settled deep within my bones. For 30 years, I had tirelessly operated under the heavy, misguided belief that my singular purpose was to provide endless financial shelter for my family, even when that family returned my devotion with toxic arrogance and vicious entitlement. I had willingly bled for ungrateful beneficiaries. That exhausting parasitic era was officially over. I handed the finalized portfolio back to Gregory, acknowledging the conclusion of our aggressive defensive campaign. I was a 58-year-old man standing at the absolute peak of my professional capacity. I possessed vast resources, deep industry knowledge, and a completely unburdened future. I would redirect my wealth toward meaningful philanthropic endeavors, toward building community infrastructure that actually mattered, and toward people who truly recognized the inherent value of hard, honest labor. I walked slowly back to the towering glass window and looked down at the bustling, vibrant streets of my beloved city, watching the endless stream of headlights moving steadily through the gathering darkness. The cold autumn wind continued to aggressively blow against the thick exterior panes, but I felt incredibly warm and remarkably calm inside. The brutal, suffocating illusion of a loving daughter had been painfully shattered, but the resulting undeniable truth had finally set me free. The weeks following my return to Chicago were marked by a profound stillness. The chaotic noise of the French countryside, the shrill demands of a fabricated aristocracy, and the suffocating pressure of my daughter's endless entitlement had all been stripped away. In their place was the predictable pulse of the city I helped construct. I walked through the downtown streets with renewed purpose. The towering skyscrapers of glass and steel did not represent mere investments. They were tangible results of honest labor, calculated risks, and uncompromising dedication. They were monuments to the exact values my daughter discarded in her pursuit of a meaningless foreign title. I foreclosed on the Chateau Rousseau 3 weeks prior. The legal execution was flawless, a testament to Gregory's meticulous preparation and international financial law. The disgraced Rousseau family was formally evicted from the crumbling estate they proudly paraded as their ancestral right. They were forced to vacate the premises under the supervision of local authorities, their aristocratic pretensions shattered by the brutal reality of unpaid debts. I immediately placed the sprawling property on the open market, specifically targeting commercial developers. The singular objective was to efficiently recoup my initial $150,000 wire transfer. Once that precise amount was securely deposited back into my accounts, the Rousseau family would be permanently erased from my life, relegated to a minor accounting error. Meanwhile, Stephanie was learning the harsh mechanics of independent survival. My private cellular phone remained entirely silent on my end, though it had registered 36 frantic missed calls from her international number during those first few chaotic days. I did not answer a single one. I did not listen to the pathetic voicemails she undoubtedly left begging for a financial rescue from the catastrophic disaster she personally engineered. I had made my position absolutely clear in the dark hall of the chateau. I was no longer her bank, and I was permanently finished serving as her invisible safety net. Through Gregory's network, I learned she scraped together enough funds to purchase a discounted ticket back to the United States. She flew across the Atlantic completely alone, sitting in a cramped seat for 9 hours. She carried nothing but a single piece of luggage containing the wrinkled remains of her designer wardrobe. There was no private jet waiting on the tarmac. There was no luxury car idling at the curb. There was only the harsh reality of a grown woman who had run out of other people's money. She would finally have to learn the true value of a hard-earned dollar by herself from this day entirely forward. I also finalized comprehensive revisions to my estate planning. Stephanie was completely removed as a beneficiary from every personal trust and corporate holding I controlled. The predatory prenuptial agreement she signed in Paris, explicitly designed to siphon my wealth into the pockets of a French con artist, was now completely worthless. It was a parasitic contract attached to a host that no longer existed. I successfully starved their greedy ambition of its vital oxygen, ensuring my life's work would never fund their arrogant existence. Removing Stephanie from the ledger was only the first step. The second step required a massive redirection of my resources. I sat at the massive oak desk in my executive office, looking down at a crisp, official document resting on the polished wood. It was a formalized bank transfer authorizing the immediate movement of $300,000. This was the exact sum I originally earmarked to finance the lavish wedding reception at the Chateau Rousseau. It was the money Stephanie demanded for her swan ice sculptures, her imported caviar, and her superficial display of fabricated wealth. I picked up my heavy silver pen and signed the authorization with a smooth, deliberate motion. I was not transferring the funds to a caterer or a florist. I was officially seeding the foundational endowment for a brand new charitable organization. I named it the Martha Memorial Foundation in quiet, respectful honor of my late wife. Martha was a remarkably grounded, practical woman who deeply understood the value of hard work. She would have despised the wasteful spectacle our daughter attempted to orchestrate in France. Martha believed in building solid foundations both in architecture and in personal character. The foundation was specifically designed to provide full comprehensive scholarships for working-class students in the greater Chicago area. I wanted to actively find the hungry, ambitious kids who possessed raw talent but lacked the financial resources to pursue higher education. I wanted to fund the next generation of dedicated architects and structural engineers. I wanted to find the young men and women eager to work their fingers to the bone, the ones who understood that true respect is earned through late nights, calloused hands, and uncompromising dedication to a difficult craft. These were the students who would look at a set of complicated blueprints and see a genuine opportunity to build something lasting. They were the ones who would respect the immense privilege of a completely paid education because they inherently knew what it meant to struggle, to sacrifice, and to constantly worry about the basic necessities of life. By redirecting the wedding funds to these specific students, I was actively ensuring that the wealth I had spent a lifetime accumulating would directly support individuals who actually mirrored the core values that built my entire empire. I placed the signed authorization document into a pristine manila envelope, feeling an incredible, profound sense of enduring peace. The dark, toxic cloud of obligation that had colored my relationship with Stephanie for so many exhausting years had finally lifted, revealing a bright, incredibly clear horizon. I was a 58-year-old man standing at the absolute pinnacle of my professional career, entirely unburdened by the parasitic demands of an ungrateful child. I pushed my chair back and slowly stood up, walking toward the massive glass window that dominated the western wall of my office. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set over the sprawling city, casting a warm golden glow across the towering buildings I had helped bring to life. The intricate network of steel, concrete, and glass was a constant, comforting reminder of what could be achieved through dedicated, honest effort. I lifted my ceramic mug and took a slow, deep sip of hot black coffee. The bitter, robust flavor grounded me perfectly in the present moment. I watched the tiny, distant cars moving along the busy avenues far below, carrying thousands of ordinary people heading home after a long, exhausting day of work. They were building their own lives, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. But the nightmare was officially over. The final decisive action had been taken. The Martha Memorial Foundation would ensure that my hard-earned wealth would be utilized to actively build people up rather than slowly rotting them from the inside out. My legacy would proudly go to the hungry, the driven, and the truly deserving. It would be entirely awarded to those who were willing to earn it through sweat and sacrifice, and it would absolutely never again be surrendered to those who simply demanded it. Love should never be measured by the depth of your wallet, and family should never treat you like a transaction. I spent many long years working my fingers to the bone, believing that providing financial security was the absolute ultimate way to show my daughter I cared. But when you give everything to someone who values status over respect, you do not earn their love. You earn their contempt. I learned that you cannot buy gratitude, and you must never set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm. True respect is earned through solid boundaries, not blank checks. If my story resonated with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next life story. Have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member? Tell me your story in the comments below. I will read everyone.